The chamber of the Galactic Council gleamed with the cold luster of polished obsidian, its vaulted ceiling reflecting the gathered representatives in eerie, fractured symmetry. It was an amphitheater of power, where empires brokered alliances and species carved out their place in the vast order of the cosmos. And today, it was where humanity's fate would be sealed. Ambassador Elias Varen stood in the center of the circular hall, his expression schooled into perfect neutrality. He had spent the past hour listening to the familiar rhetoric, the same weary justifications dressed in different words. The conclusion had been predetermined before the session had even begun. He was not here to change minds. A towering Vorthan warlord, Grand Marshal Torvak, loomed over the assembly from his elevated seat, his crimson exoskeleton gleaming beneath the chamber's artificial light. His mandibles clicked in amusement as he finally delivered the words everyone had been waiting for. Humanity's membership in this council has always been conditional, Torvak intoned, his voice a guttural rumble. You were granted protection, resources, and guidance. And yet, after centuries, what have you offered in return? He let the question linger, scanning the faces of his fellow counselors, relishing their shared disdain. You lack military strength. Your influence is negligible. You are weak. A murmur of agreement rippled through the chamber. Some, like the reptilian Zelvar delegation, openly sneered. Others merely watched in silence, indifferent to the spectacle. Elias clasped his hands behind his back. Is that truly how you see us? He asked, his tone almost casual. Torvak's mandibles spread in what passed for a grin. Is there another way? Elias exhaled slowly. He had prepared for this moment. The words he spoke next had to be measured, weighted, calculated for effect. The Terran Accord was forged under the premise of cooperation, not servitude, he said. Our contributions may not have been through brute force, but we have upheld our obligations. Trade, diplomacy, technology. He let his gaze sweep the chamber, daring them to contradict him. If you cast us out, what message does that send? That this council values only domination. Torvak gave a low, chittering laugh. We value survival. And humanity is a liability. His multifaceted eyes glinted. The vote is final. Elias did not look toward the central holodisplay as it confirmed what he already knew. An overwhelming majority had voted for Earth's expulsion. A few abstained. None had supported humanity's continued place in the galactic order. A lesser representative might have pleaded, might have raged. Elias simply nodded. Very well. Torvak's amusement faltered slightly at the lack of resistance. You accept this? Of course. Elias smiled faintly. We have always known where we stand with you. He turned smoothly, striding toward the exit with measured steps. He did not rush. He did not falter. As he passed beneath the grand archway, he spoke one last time, his voice carrying just enough weight to settle in the minds of those listening. Be careful what you cast aside. And then he was gone. The shuttle ride back to the fleet was silent. The two Terran officers who flanked Elias, Kale Doran and Admiral Celine Voris, waited until they were safely within the warship's secure debriefing chamber before speaking. They actually did it, Kale said, his voice laced with disbelief. He leaned against the bulkhead, arms crossed over his chest. Those sanctimonious bastards actually did it. Celine, standing with her hands behind her back, was unreadable. She had never expected anything different. Elias removed his diplomatic sash and set it aside with deliberate care. It changes nothing, Kale scoffed. We just lost all legal protections. Our trade networks will be sanctioned. The Council has basically put a target on Earth's back. Celine's voice cut through the tension, calm and certain. Then it's time. Kale hesitated. Then he nodded. Elias stepped forward and activated the holodisplay at the center of the room. The screen flickered to life, revealing a vast network of encrypted operations. Sleeper agents embedded within key Council sectors, hidden fleets lurking beyond sensor range, supply caches buried beneath the surface of long-forgotten moons. This was Project Revenant, the contingency plan humanity had never spoken of, but had always been prepared to enact. Celine studied the data streams with quiet satisfaction. We've spent decades making them believe we were insignificant, she said. Now they won't see us coming. Elias turned to face her. How long until we're ready? We already are. Cale let out a slow breath. Then we make the first move. Elias's gaze darkened. No, he said softly. We make the only move. And across the void of space, unseen by the Council, the first Terran warships slipped from their hidden sanctuaries, vanishing into the darkness. The war had not begun with explosions. There were no grand declarations, no fleets clashing in open space, no visible enemy to rally against. That was the beauty of it. Humanity had always fought wars the way it had lived, adaptable, relentless, patient. The Galactic Council had chosen to expel them, believing their fate was sealed. What they had failed to consider was what would happen when humanity no longer had rules to follow. From the bridge of the Erebus, Admiral Celine Voris observed the silent dance of the void. The ship, a specter of matte black alloys and sensor-dampening fields, drifted just outside the Council's patrol grid. Even if an enemy vessel passed within a few hundred meters, they would see nothing but empty space. The Council had built its fleets around open confrontation, relying on energy shielding and massed firepower. That kind of arrogance had cost many civilizations their lives. Now, it would cost the Council its grip on the stars. A low chime resonated through the command deck. Phase 1 is complete, reported Cale Doran from his station. His voice was calm, but there was something almost predatory in his gaze. Another 5 supply convoys have been misplaced. Celine nodded, reviewing the data as it populated across the holoscreen. Council outposts in the outer systems were suffering inexplicable shortages. Missing shipments, communications blackouts, automated defense grids failing without reason. No alarms had been raised. Not yet. The screen flickered, displaying a direct transmission from Elias Varen. He sat within the war room of a hidden Terran base, his face partially illuminated by the soft glow of strategic overlays. The Council is beginning to notice the disruptions, he said. They've doubled patrols along the major routes, but they don't know what they're looking for. They're expecting pirates, Celine remarked. They always have, Elias agreed. They assume anything outside their control is disorder. They don't recognize an enemy operating in silence. Cale leaned forward. How long until they realize it's us? Elias didn't hesitate. Not until it's too late. The Council's fleets had always been built for deterrence, overwhelming in scale and power. But what good was an armada if there was nothing to strike? The Erebus and her sister ships existed in the spaces between their enemies' understanding. Black voids between sensor sweeps, phantom signals within encrypted channels. They did not fight battles. They erased the conditions that allowed them to exist. A new alert pulsed across the display. Celine focused on the latest report. An entire station has gone dark. Elias narrowed his eyes. Which one? Outpost Theta 9, Cale answered, sifting through the data. No distress signals. No emergency beacons. Just silence. Celine frowned. This was unexpected. Every operation had been carefully orchestrated to destabilize, not destroy. A missing supply shipment could be overlooked. A lost patrol could be explained away. But an entire station vanishing without a trace? That was something else. A cold realization settled in the room. We weren't the ones who did this, Elias said quietly. Celine tapped a control on her console, pulling up Theta 9's last recorded transmissions. The logs were incomplete, abruptly cut off in the middle of routine status reports. But there was something buried beneath the layers of static. A fragmented voice, distorted and broken. Not alone. Shadows. Everywhere. Don't. The message ended. A silence stretched between them. Cale exhaled. That wasn't one of ours. Elias studied the display for a long moment before speaking. Someone else is moving against the Council. Celine's fingers hovered over the interface. This changed things. Up until now, the war had been humanity's alone, waged in secrecy, dictated on their terms. But if another force was operating in the dark, then their careful orchestration was no longer entirely within their control. Elias straightened. We need to know who they are. Celine met his gaze. and whether they are an ally or a threat. The Erebus adjusted course, gliding silently toward the last known location of Theta 9. Somewhere in the cold abyss, another player had entered the board. The war had just become far more complicated. The wreckage of Outpost Theta 9 drifted like a frozen graveyard in the void. Hull fragments floated in slow spirals, some still glowing faintly from energy burns. The station had not simply lost power, it had been eviscerated, torn apart with precise, methodical force. Whatever had done this had not been sloppy. It had been deliberate. Aboard the Erebus, Celine Voris studied the tactical display, her expression unreadable. The remnants of the outpost told her a story, but one with missing pages. There were no distress signals, no lifeboats, no emergency beacons. Just silence. They didn't have time to send a full warning, Cale muttered from his console, shifting through the fragmented data logs. Whatever hit them, it happened fast. Elias Varon, standing with his arms folded, exhaled slowly. This wasn't a battle. His eyes tracked the patterns in the wreckage, the way the structural failures aligned, the absence of certain debris. This was an execution. Celine's fingers hovered over the command panel. "Pull long-range scans," she ordered. "We need to know if there's anything left." Cale complied, his brow furrowing as sensor data fed onto the screen. "There's something, an energy signature at the station's core." He magnified the image, revealing a twisted fragment of the outpost's power relay. Nestled within the wreckage was an object, a small, spherical device pulsing faintly with blue light. "That doesn't match any Council technology," Elias noted. Celine tapped her earpiece. "Deploy a probe. I want a full analysis." Minutes later, a drone launched from the Erebus, gliding silently toward the debris field. As it neared the device, its sensors flared, an encryption key embedded in the signal. Cale's console beeped sharply. "We're receiving a transmission." He hesitated. "It's not Council encryption. It's something else." Elias stepped closer. "Patch it through." The message was distorted, layered in static, but a voice emerged, low, rough, and unfamiliar. "They are not gods. They can bleed. Do not stand alone." And then, silence. A heavy stillness settled over the command deck. Celine's mind moved quickly, analyzing possibilities. This was confirmation. Humanity was not the only force working against the Council. But whoever had destroyed Theta 9 had not done so with precision strikes or covert sabotage. They had chosen annihilation. Cale exhaled. "I don't know if that's a warning or an invitation." Elias's gaze remained locked on the fading energy signature. "Maybe it's both." Before Celine could respond, an alert blared across the deck. Long-range sensors had detected movement. Multiple contacts, incoming at high velocity. Cale's hands flew across his console. Council fleet, 17 warships, closing fast. Celine's pulse remained steady. They had been careful, but not invisible. The destruction of Theta 9 had drawn attention, and the Council was moving to reclaim control. Elias's jaw tightened. "They won't assume we're here yet. Their focus is on finding whoever did this. But if they find us," Cale said grimly, "there won't be time for assumptions." Celine made her decision. "Engage silent running. We hold position." The Erebus dimmed, its systems shifting into a near-dormant state, heat dispersing to match the cold void. The Council fleet swept in moments later, their massive forms casting shadows over the debris field. Fighters deployed, scanning the wreckage. For now, they were blind. Elias watched the main display. "They'll investigate, report their findings. We have time, but not much." Celine's voice was quiet, decisive. "Then we need to act first." Cale looked at her. "You're suggesting an attack?" Elias shook his head. "No. We don't reveal ourselves. But we can make sure they leave the system with the wrong conclusions." Celine nodded, already formulating the next move. "We feed them a trail. Make them think this was something else. Something bigger." Cale's lips curled into a smirk. "A phantom enemy?" Elias's expression hardened. "Exactly." Celine gave the order, and the Erebus moved unseen through the debris field, carefully planting false signals, corrupted transmissions, scattered wreckage, breadcrumbs leading the Council toward an enemy that did not exist. By the time they left, they would be chasing shadows. And in those shadows, humanity would be waiting. The Council fleet departed Theta 9's wreckage 3 hours later, their warships burning toward a false trail, chasing phantoms of their own making. By the time their investigators pieced together the deception, it would be too late. The real threat would have already moved beyond their reach. Aboard the Erebus, the bridge remained quiet as the last enemy vessel disappeared from long-range sensors. The silence was not relief. It was calculation. They took the bait, Kale muttered, watching the fleet's trajectory. They're diverting resources to hunt something that doesn't exist. Elias nodded, his arms crossed. Which means they're vulnerable somewhere else. Celine studied the galactic map hovering before them, her sharp gaze following the shifting lines of projected fleet movements. The Council's forces were vast, but they were rigid, designed for overwhelming force, not adaptation. Their strength had always been their greatest weakness. They're pulling ships from the core worlds to reinforce the outer sectors, she observed. It leaves their inner defenses stretched thin. Kale exhaled. We could strike at one of their central command stations. Maybe even sever their main supply networks. Elias turned to Celine. What's the most valuable target? She considered the question carefully. Each decision now was a step toward something irreversible. Humanity had hidden for so long, but the time for shadows was nearly over. The Council's primary military AI is housed on Velcaris Prime, she said at last. It coordinates logistics, fleet deployments, defensive algorithms. If we take it offline, the entire network shatters. Every warship, every planetary defense grid, they'll be fighting blind. Kale let out a low whistle. That's not just an attack. That's decapitation. Elias's expression was unreadable. We'd be exposing ourselves. Celine met his gaze. That was always inevitable. For a long moment, no one spoke. The war had been waged in secrecy, in sabotage, in shadows. But the nature of war was change. A strike against Velcaris Prime wouldn't just weaken the Council. It would announce to the galaxy that humanity was no longer in exile, no longer prey. Elias finally exhaled, slow and measured. Then we make it count. Celine turned to her crew. Prepare the fleet. Across the dark expanse, hidden Terran warships activated in silence, engines flaring to life. No longer waiting. No longer hiding. The next move belonged to humanity.